Welcome to Expanding Access, a podcast by Behavioral Health Tech, where we explore the cutting edge of mental health, substance use, and autism and IDD care. Each episode features insightful conversations with industry leaders who are driving real change through technology and innovation. Whether you're a provider, payer, or just passionate about expanding access to behavioral health care, you won't want to miss these stories. Let's dive in. Hello, everyone. My name is Solome Tibabu. I'm the host of the Expanding Access podcast, where we talk about expanding support for mental health, addiction, IDD support for youth and adults alike. And so today we've got such a wonderful guest. Rich, I can't wait for you to introduce yourself. We've got a lot of content to cover and a really exciting initiative. So why don't we go ahead and jump right in? Please, Rich, can you share a little background?
Yeah, I'd love to. And first, thank you for inviting me. I'm a little starstruck because I'm a fan of yours. And so it's nice to be here. And I'm really grateful for the invitation to share a little bit about myself and more importantly, about the Youth Mental Health Fund at Decolonizing Wealth Project. But we can start with me. And usually when I talk about myself, I always start at the beginning. So folks think it's going to be a really long story. I'll try to not make it that long, but I do like to start because I think where we're from matters and where we're from shapes us and continues to shape us. And so I grew up as a curious, spiritual, kind of weird, very closeted gay kid in rural Mississippi. My hometown is less than 1,000 people. It's 20 minutes from a stoplight and it's 45 minutes from Walmart, which is how we measure things in the South. And so I grew up a fifth generation in a really tiny town in the South. And so I named that, especially in this context in this podcast, to say that I know what it's like to grow up in a place wrestling with my own identity and my own mental health struggles and not even having that language at the time, but knowing what it's like to navigate that in a place with a real lack of access to good care. And so, I think one of the things that I like to remember too is that I also know what it's like for well-meaning adults who didn't have the training they needed, but who tried really hard to offer care to me in a place that didn't have a lot of other options. And so I'm really grateful for those people who stood in that gap. And a lot of those people came from church. And so a lot of the care that I received, and if we're honest, the wounds that I still have are from a Christian community, a small church in my town in Mississippi. But because a lot of that care came from there, I decided early on that I was going to be a pastor, which makes total sense for a closeted gay kid in rural Mississippi who didn't have very religious parents. But that's what I decided. And I think at a base level, I just wanted to create the kinds of healing spaces and caring spaces and connectivity that so many people had done for me in the context of the church. And so I studied religion in undergrad. I went and got my master's of divinity in seminary or divinity school. And then I moved to Chicago, and I've been here for 11 years and some change. And I love calling this place home. And my partner is from here. He's a high school orchestra teacher, started school yesterday. So he spends his days literally on the ground, on the front lines of youth mental health care, creating some good space for his amazing students. And I love it in this city, but I had my sights set on being a pastor. That's why I moved to Chicago. And for my first 8 years here, that's what I did. I was a pastor in some capacity and spent the bulk of my time leading a diverse spiritual community for young adults called the Inclusive Collective, which was a spiritual community focused on healing and meaning making and justice. And my time there really changed me because the people that I worked with changed me. It was a community of mostly 18 to 25-year-olds. And I got to be intimately connected to some of their moments of deep pain, whether it was being on the quad in the weeks following the murder of George Floyd, whether it was walking into spaces the day after the 2016 election, accompanying students to the hospital for suicidal ideation, or sitting with a student. I remember one of their fathers died, and the next day I was the person there, sitting with them in the moments of deep pain. And so I say that to name that I know what it's like to be in those moments of pain. And it doesn't stop there, though. The way they shaped me also was because of their immense power. So the zeal for justice, the relentless zeal for justice that would never take no for an answer, I like to joke that so many times they were, by day, the people in the community were shutting down the president's office in protest of the university. And by night, they were in healing circles that our community was creating. And their pain was real, but, and I like to emphasize this, so was their power and their promise. One of the things that kind of gets on my nerves, honestly, these days is I think that in these conversations we have about youth mental health, it can almost be popular to be voyeuristic to people's pain without also being witness to their power. And so I just want to be a person and this fund to be a fund that always, always, always emphasizes the amazing capacity of young people. And so those two things, the pain and the power, really shaped me and changed me and sort of like invited me to be a different person. And during that season also, I was super frustrated with philanthropy, the field I now work in, because I was like, wow, this field feels so allergic to funding anything that isn't quote unquote evidence-based, it's particularly spirituality and wellness and healing work. This field, as we know, gives far too little to queer communities and communities of color. And so I thought, well, maybe I can get in there in a little bit of like a Trojan horse moment and help shake some things up from the inside. And so I entered philanthropy, hoping to move more money, resources to organizations doing soulful work with young people, particularly queer folks and communities of color. And I committed to trying to be the kind of program officer I wish I would have had when I was leading a community, and one who knows the pain and power, one who knows the emotional labor this work takes, one who really gets what it's like to do this work on the ground instead of just theorize about it. I haven't been perfect at that, but that's my aim. And I have people who hold me accountable, especially as a white person in this complicated field of philanthropy. And so then after that, I moved into philanthropy, started working at the now Sunset Wayfair Foundation, where we moved resources to organizations working at the intersection of spirituality and justice. A lot of youth work, some really cool youth grant making work where youth were able to have full agency to grant make to organizations in Chicago. And then past May, just a couple of months ago, I joined Decolonizing Wealth Project, and I think we'll get a little bit more into that in a few minutes. And I joined, my first day on the job was the day before the Youth Mental Health Fund launched. So it's been an amazing adventure over these past couple of months, and it's a real honor to get to steward this fund as we do storytelling and learning and grant making, all aimed at creating a culturally responsive youth mental health care ecosystem, particularly for BIPOC and queer young people. And the last thing I'll say is I joined DWP particularly in this moment, and I think for lots of reasons, but some of it kind of crystallizes for me in like two words. And one is timing and one is calling. And the timing is really important because I'm just convinced, Solomay, that right now that our world really needs movements and organizations and people who speak and work with both boundless grace and a relentless passion for justice, who hold both love and justice as inseparable forces, who really view the work before us as sacred. And I think that's really going to be the way we move forward. And I think people are watching how this fund moves and what we do and who we find. And so I move into this role with a lot of joy and also recognizing the responsibility that I have to steward this, not alone with so many amazing people, but to play a role in stewarding it. Particularly right now with, name the things, right? DEI under assault, the hotline closing down, Medicaid cuts, government funding in other ways, legislation across the country that's advancing, particularly harming trans youth, like all these pieces. It's like really important time. And the second piece that's calling is that I told you that I wanted to be a pastor when I was a teenager. And some people are like, well, you don't do that anymore. And I would say, well, I kind of do in some ways. And so I feel like this is really a natural extension of my calling from 20 years ago. In fact, Bishop William Barber, who is a mover and shaker for justice in this country, wrote the foreword to Edgar Villanueva's book, our CEO. And he says in there that he sees Jesus in the words and deeds of Edgar and Decolonizing Wealth Project. And so I feel like I get to still embody my vocation just in a little bit of a different place. And particularly for me, I say calling because youth mental health is not about studies and stats and reports for me. It is about people and faces and names and relationships and stories. And so when I do this work, it's not theoretical, but it really does matter for me. And so it's not just a job, but it is a definite calling. And so I feel really honored to do this work right now, particularly with the timing and the calling.
Well, that is just so beautiful to reflect on not only the pain, but also the power of youth today, and how fortunate we are that you get to be the leader of this new youth mental health fund housed at the Decolonizing Wealth Project. For the audience, for those who don't know, outside of my many roles, leading the behavioral health tech community and event, I also had the honor of being the co-chair to develop this fund for months, and we couldn't be more thrilled to have Rich as our leader. And so perhaps we can segue into sharing more about what is the new Youth Mental Health Fund all about? Who are you focused on? And tell us a little bit more about Decolonizing Wealth Project as well.
Yeah, of course. Well, I have a question back to you is like, what don't you do? I feel like you do so many things. And seriously, thank you for all the work you do, the good work that shapes the sector and the field. It's really meaningful. And I love being your friend on LinkedIn so I can stay up to date and get your emails. And so seriously, I really appreciate all the work you do.
Stay very up to date. It's way too many posts.
No, it's not way too many. It's just the right amount, I would say. So Celebrate DWP, Decolonizing Wealth Project, started in 2018. And what predates the starting of the organization is that our CEO and founder, Edgar Villanueva, wrote a book called Decolonizing Wealth that quickly became like the it book to read if you're in philanthropy and adjacent sectors. In fact, it was the first book that I ever read about philanthropy. And I'm eternally grateful because it sort of set the pace for me and set the challenge for me about how I wanted to be and what I wanted to do in this field. And it became the book that was required reading for all members of my team. And so I get to know the movement, the book, the organization from afar before I was a part of it. And the organization came after the book, and really this effort to say books can often be a moment, but if we want to leverage them into something bigger, how do we create organizations to help them become more than a moment, but a movement? And so with this deep belief that Edgar has and our organization has that money can be medicine, the organization launched the same year as the book. And one of the things that I love and one of the things that attracted me about working here is best summed up, I think, in this quote from one of my favorite spiritual teachers, Richard Rohr. And he says, the best criticism of the bad is the practice of the better. The best criticism of the bad is the practice of the better. So philanthropy has done some good across time and space. And we also know that philanthropy has been infected and has perpetuated the same ills and injustices and inequities that have plagued our country since the beginning. And there's a move to critique that, right? To critique the ways that philanthropy has done those things. And I think that's a great move. We should not be shy. We should unapologetically name all of the ways that philanthropy has inflicted harm. We should confess those and lament those 100%. I think, though, that if we stop there at the confessing the harms and don't also think about how to move forward in a more generative and justice-oriented way, then our effort is short-sighted. And what I love about DWP is, if you've read the book and others that are listening maybe have and know our work, that we don't shy away from naming the harm. And we also want to invite people, all of us, to imagine a better future and what philanthropy can look like and what it means to embody the truth that money can be medicine. And DWP, another reason why I came here, it hasn't been particularly interested in just some cosmetic fixes at the top to do a few things on the surface and make it appear as all is well, but has been inviting us all to do deep, deep work. I would call it soul work to get to a deeper level of like what it means to be animated by something bigger than ourselves, what it means to really trust communities, especially communities of color that have been marginalized and kept out of philanthropy for so long. What does it mean to really value justice, not when it's a fad, but forever? What does it mean to do this work and to really root in something bigger and to heal? And that's the way that we want to move forward. And so my amazing colleagues, I hesitate to even say we yet, because I've just been here a couple of months, but my amazing colleagues have been stewarding this work, moving over $700 million in reparative giving. Our donor and funder community Liberated Capital has moved over 23 million to 100% BIPOC-led efforts in the past 5 years or so. And so doing this amazing work. And DWP as it moves forward and transforms wealth into collective well-being is our goal. As we move forward, we operate in a couple different ways. Just briefly, sector transformation. How do we create experiences that invite foundations and high net worth folks into healing to ultimately give more money to this in this reparative, justice-oriented way? We do narrative work around storytelling, telling powerful stories that move hearts and minds and money. And then we do reparative giving or grant making, which is the area that I work in. And we have a few different, we do earth and climate, economic, solidarity, and then also well-being. And it's all in service to what we call our moonshot, which you may have heard about, which is our 10-year strategic effort to move 1 trillion with a T, $1 trillion to justice-oriented healing work. We call it reparative giving in the field. And so it's a big, audacious goal, but we live in a time where it's really important. And Edgar wrote when we released this moonshot that philanthropy has a choice. We have a decision to make. We can grab the fire hose or we can let our house burn. And this initiative, the moonshot, was started before 2025 hit. And now we know that it's even more needed now than ever. And so that's our goal and what we're striving for. And then the Youth Mental Health Fund, which is why we're here today, a $20 million initiative with seed funding from Pivotal, which we're so grateful for, is an initiative, a fund to grant $15 million in direct funding over the next 3 years to organizations doing culturally responsive youth mental health care, particularly with BIPOC and LGBTQ youth, especially those who embody both of those identities. And as we talked about earlier, we know that youth are experiencing a lot of pain right now. And as we talked about it earlier, youth have been drivers of social change in this country forever. Try to imagine Selma or Standing Rock without the power of youth, and those movements don't exist. And also right now, due to lots of things, right? The world that youth have inherited, technology that we're trying to figure out every day how to navigate, racism, extremist violence, climate change, all these things are creating these conditions where, youth mental health struggle is real and it lands not on everybody equally. We know that it lands on youth of color and queer youth, particularly youth who are at the intersection of those identities even more. And so as a result, and listeners to your podcast will know that anxiety and depression and suicide rates are higher for those groups. And Dr. Alfre's research at the Coma Project is a great resource for folks who are looking into more about that. And this fund takes all of that seriously and knows that one of the ways that we can work on this is to create better pathways, avenues, easier access to culturally responsive youth mental health care. And that's what we're trying to do. And so we have this $15 million, $5 million a year for the next 3 years. It's just the seed funding. We hope to grow the fund. And it was created, the parameters were given by amazing folks like yourself and Dr. Alfie and members of the Design Council, as well as a powerful group of youth who also set up the parameters of this fund. And so we're giving in some pretty expansive ways, community-based solutions, heritage-based wellness programs, storytelling and advocacy work to work on systemic change. The field is pretty expansive. But the last thing I'll name is one of the things that's really important to us, a slogan popularized by the disability justice movement, nothing about us without us. And so this fund takes seriously the voice, power, and agency of young people. So a third of our advisory committee is made up of youth. And those are people who have I don't even make funding decisions. I work in philanthropy. I don't make funding decisions. At DWP, we believe in participatory grant making. And so that group has full agency to give the $5 million to organizations that they vet and research and evaluate. And a third of those are youth. And then a big part of the evaluation for organizations is, do these organizations take seriously the agency and voice of young people, not in a tokenizing way, but in a way that centers youth in program design, execution, and strategy? And so that's a part of the fund that I'm very excited about too.
It's so exciting. And congratulations again. We're all just so thrilled that it's come to life, so needed. And as you mentioned, this model is really unique to offer this kind of leadership to youth who we're looking to impact. And so really wonderful. But if I could follow up on something you said, could you tell our audience a little bit more about what does culturally responsive youth mental health care mean to you, and how are you defining it in your work with the fund?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I've been chewing on it. And one of the things that I thought about, I often think Salome in story or narrative, I think it's part of growing up in the South, and that kind of a storytelling culture. And so one of the stories that's been bouncing around in my head and my heart and my body for a while, and not just about this question, but just in general, something I've been chewing on and digesting. A little over a year ago, I was visiting an amazing organization in Rapid City, South Dakota, which is the homeland of the Lakota people. And while I was there, I saw this organization who does powerful healing work with adults and young people. And they've taken traditional indigenous approaches and wed them with Western psychological approaches to healing and mental health. And so I was at this organization and I was asking the founder and leader about his diagnosis of like what our current situation is. Like, what is his read on things, just in a sort of conversation, casual conversation. And he thought for a minute and then he just said the word disconnection. And I was sort of intrigued. I was asking him about like the big issues of our day. And he said one word, disconnection. And then he went to elaborate a little bit. And he said, I think that most of the current problems in our day can be traced back, rooted in disconnection. We're disconnected from the earth. So we wreak havoc on our planet. We're a crisis of climate change. We're disconnected from each other. And so we have this crisis of both loneliness and injustice perpetuated against many marginalized groups. We have this disconnection from something bigger than us. Some call it a higher power or something more. And so we have this crisis of people wondering, what's my meaning? What's my purpose? And then particularly about this conversation in youth mental health, we have this disconnection from ourselves, from the deepest part of ourselves. And so it's no wonder that we're having a lot of issues with mental health that are plaguing all of us. And so I was thinking about that story because I sit in spaces, and I know you do too, so often, philanthropic spaces, academic spaces, where we just use all this jargon to talk about mental health. And it just feels like so disconnected from local communities, particularly this fund, so disconnected from the lived realities of youth that we're supporting, particularly BIPOC and queer youth. And as a closeted gay kid who grew up in rural Mississippi, I can assure you, we don't talk like that, like we do in those philanthropic spaces in Mississippi. And so I would just been thinking a lot about like those spaces that I'm in, and the spaces, honestly, that I perpetuate, right? I get into those conversations and use a language that doesn't make sense. And so I've been thinking a lot about like those spaces in contrast to this elder and founder of this organization who was talking about youth mental health care using language and practices that hit the soul of his community instead of importing languages and practices that would be foreign and ineffective to his community. And just the power of that, there's tons of definitions. People write think pieces every other day about what culturally responsive youth mental health care can be. And we can talk about those, at a base level. I think about an approach to care that is rooted in, inspired by particular folks' cultural identities and languages and heritage and practices and spiritualities. An approach that doesn't just sort of take practices and adapt to those, but an approach that's actually rooted in, inspired by, informed by, dictated by particular culture and design and implementation. But honestly, I think the story from Rapid City does a better job than any of those definitional work about what culturally responsive youth mental health care is. And one of the reasons I love this fund and one of the reasons I was excited to apply for this role is because DWP and the work you all did in the Design Council intentionally set it up so that it would have an expansive view of what mental health is, including, but not overly indexed to, clinical approaches. And so as the fund is launched, I get asked 1 million times a day, like, how are you all drawing the line about what counts and what doesn't count as youth mental health care? And that's a good conversation. We can perhaps have that. But I'll tell you, Salome, right now, I feel much less interested in policing like what quote unquote counts, and much more excited and by naming and celebrating and funding what actually works. So we can have these conversations about boundaries. And I know people peddle harmful things. And so I don't want to discount that. And we need to have those conversations. Yes, 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 yes. And I'm just really interested and frankly more excited about naming, celebrating, again, funding approaches that use both new and ancient methods, but that have often been discounted by mainstream, usually white mental health care approaches.
Thanks so much, Rich. I totally agree. And something that I think you have a lot of experience in, and we're touching on here, is this idea of non-clinical care, accessing mental health support through religious settings is where a lot of, especially underrepresented youth, are getting any kind of support. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. Well, I first say anytime I'm talking about religion, especially as a white Christian person, I like to name just a few realities that I think need to be named and addressed before we can dive into conversations like this. One is the real and present danger of white Christian nationalism. We see it infecting our public life here and around the world. Second is the harm that my tradition in particular has perpetuated against queer people. One of my colleagues, Teresa Mateus, calls wounds you get from religion as sacred wounds, which I think is a really apt descriptor for a lot of people that have those sacred, deep sacred wounds from the harm the church has caused. And the third thing that I name in this is the way the church has really botched talking about mental health, right? And just like produced a real sense of shame for some people, a sense of you didn't pray hard enough to get rid of any sort of mental health struggle you're happening. And then also the way the church uses like quote unquote biblical counseling to just prop up conversion therapy or all these other sorts of harmful like therapies that are perpetuated. So just want to like name those things first before I talk about some of the benefits. So those things are all true, particularly in my own community. And we need to name the harm and also realize that religion still matters for a lot of people. And it may be shrinking. The amount of religious adherence may be shrinking in this country, although the newest stats say that that even has plateaued a little bit. But even if it's shrinking, then we still have huge groups of people. I'm one of them that religion matters for. And the number of religious adherents only goes up if we're talking about communities of color, low-income communities, rural communities, Southern communities. And then I think people often like to think like queer people aren't religious. Well, that's not couldn't be further from the truth. The latest stats from Williams Institute talk about 40% of queer adults are religious. The number skyrockets to 70% of Black queer adults. And so to have this conversation about mental health, without also talking, without at least acknowledging and figuring out how to work inside religious theologies, communities, et cetera, I think is a little bit short-sighted and incomplete. So that's sort of religious adherence. The other thing that I think matters here is religious institutions, right? And so like, for instance, the Black church, I think many would argue for the last 400 years has been an anchor institution of Black communities well before the establishment of the formal Black church. And so again, to talk about how to reach communities, especially if we're talking about communities of color, and to leave out huge institutions like the Black church, to me, is just really, it's kind of asinine. And people, I think religious communities, again, naming the harm, being real about it, religious communities can also be amazing sources of life and goodness and mental health care for all people, especially youth. I think there's a couple examples I would name. One is Rami Nashashibi and Alia Bilal in Chicago at the Inner City Muslim Action Network. And at their center, you will find amazing opportunities for prayer. And you will also find licensed therapists who have been trained in how to do therapy in ways that are culturally responsive to the Muslim community in Chicago. And so the beautiful example of the wedding of these things are just earlier today, I had a great meeting with Dr. Sherry Moloch at George Washington. She's doing amazing work, pioneering work about suicide prevention in Black churches. Instead of adding something on to people's lives, meeting people where they are and integrating care. And she's an adolescent psychologist, integrating care and a pastor. And so integrating care into those spaces. And so there's a few ways I think that it's very possible. It's not for everybody, but to discount religious communities and religious adherence in the conversation about mental health, I think doesn't make much sense.
Such good points. And wow, I didn't realize many of those things. Thank you for sharing. You've shared a lot with our audience already on the content of the population you're looking to support. Maybe we can pivot a little now to the current state of funding for this kind of work, supporting youth mental health. What can we do for philanthropy to fund more work like this?
It's a great question, Salome. I love my field and I often critique it from the inside. And seriously, I want to be invitational, right? Of like ways we can move forward and ways I can move forward, right? I get things wrong all the time. And so how we can constantly being in like a state of an iterative mode of learning and growing. And so just a few of the realities related to this fund, we can break it up into a few different ways. And one is state of BIPOC funding. Only 2.9% of philanthropic funding is going directly to communities of color, which is a dismal stat. What's even worse is that percentage decreased from 2021 to 2022. And so we had this immediate post-George Floyd moment. And then a lot of the funding, when it wasn't a fad anymore, decreased from funders. A lot of promises made that were not kept as well. Then we have queer funding. It's not great there either. Also a decrease, 22% decrease from 2022 to 2023 when adjusted for inflation for funding going to queer communities. That number is larger for queer communities of color, larger being the decrease is larger for queer communities of color. When we get into mental health funding, told you some bad news. So the news is a little bit better with some caveats. So the good news is that between 2015 and 2022, funding doubled for mental health, which is great. The complicated news is most of that came from, I think, about 5 funders. And so it's a small pool of people who are doing the heavy lifting in that work. And still, even with that increase, only about 1.7% of philanthropic dollars are going to mental health work. So, for instance, the Youth Mental Health Fund, we got over 1,500 applications. And we've been clear about this from the beginning is we have enough funds for about $5 million and 30 to 50 grants. Over $207 million in dollars was requested. And so just that anecdotal evidence alone shows us we need more funding moving fast and not after 10 reports, but quickly to this area. Some good reports here, though, are like youth mental health is a focus for a lot of people. And so there has been sort of resurgence and thanks, and I mean this like into your work and Dr. Alfie's and others who are encouraging funding to move into this area. And then there's some anecdotal evidence, at least, of people being a little bit more expansive in their definition of what youth mental health is. And so being willing to move beyond only clinical approaches to funding other types of work. Although still, it feels like every day I have partners, grantees, people I know in the field who lament that they talk to people in philanthropy and they ask them questions people in philanthropy love to ask about ROI and what's your evidence base and all these sorts of things. And often are really still allergic to this kind of healing work that we're talking about here. And so lots of room for growth. So those are BIPOC queer funding, mental health funding. And then, of course, right now we can't have a conversation about funding without talking about government funding. So slashes from government grants. Now we're going to have tons of Medicaid cuts, which is just going to be, the effects downstream are going to be really rough. I read applications every day talking about people not knowing how they're going to make it into the next couple months, much less years, with such decrease in government funding. What we're trying to do, we can't fix all that. We don't pretend we can. We are trying to play a role in sector transformation. And in this particular fund, we're trying to take all that into account with how we design and execute the fund and with how the design council, you all designed it, which is that we're prioritizing LGBTQ youth and youth of color, particularly those at that intersection, and representational leadership matters for these organizations. The second is that we view culturally responsive care, we view it as both right, as in it is a moral good, and effective, as in it is strategic. It is good to do because it makes sense. And so our funding, we fund, as I said, youth mental health care in a variety of ways with an expansive view of what it can be. And the good news for me, being at DWP as a new staff member, is that DWP has a history of doing this work. Nearly 100%, I think 100% of our funding from the past several years has gone to communities of color and a sizable amount of queer folks, and that number will just increase with this fund. And also, DWP has been serious since the beginning about funding all sorts of ancient and innovative methods for healing and justice. And so we're honored to get to steward this fund and in a way fits seamlessly into the work that my amazing colleagues have been doing for many years, preparing the organization to hold this fund as well. And I'll just name, DWP has a series of beliefs we use that animate, inspire the work we do, and particularly in impacting the sector. And as we think about what it means to help philanthropy move more money to this work, right? And not just like get excited about it, but move more money, dollars to this work, three things I think are coming up for me from our set of beliefs. And one is that mutual healing is the only path to mutual thriving. And so if we're going to do the work of sector transformation, we need to create, and we are creating spaces where all people can receive healing and become the kinds of people that move resources in these ways, right? And that really find something deeper to cling to and root in. The second is that speaking truth and love makes the truth easier to hear and believe and act on. And so, as I said before, we don't shy away from telling the truth, naming the reality, telling the stats, naming what's broken, confessing it. And we also strive to be invitational to say, but it doesn't have to be this way. And we can imagine a better future together, and let's move there together. And we try to do that in ways that, again, unapologetically naming what is and try to winsomely invite people into what could be. And then the last piece is that stories draw people in and tools help people move forward. And so in this work, we're going to tell powerful stories. I'll say we're going to amplify powerful stories that already exist. And we will be working diligently, and already are, to create the types of tools and resources and practical resources that help philanthropy catch the vision and move more money in this way.
What a great approach, and so needed again right now. What I took from what you said is that really everyone has a role right now to support youth mental health. And then, in fact, maybe I could ask you a couple more questions. That might be one of them. How would you think adults in other settings, all sorts of settings that interact with youth, such as teachers, instructors, so on and so forth, what can they do to support with addressing the youth mental health crisis we're in now?
Oh, lots of things. That's a great question. And I think a lot about how so many of the things we want to do in this field or others, right? It's like addition work, like add this program, add this initiative, add this thing to your already busy life. And then because you're busier, you'll have better mental health outcomes. It's just like, I don't know that this quite makes sense. And so a lot of what I think about is like, maybe it's not always about adding, although it can be helpful, right? Like I added therapy in seasons in my life that I needed to add that for my own mental health. But what if it's less about addition always and more about integration? And so how do we integrate this youth mental health work? And all people can do it in some small ways. How do we integrate this into places where young people already live and work and play and study and worship? I think we talked about before. And a few things come to mind for people in these spaces that to get ready and to do this kind of work. And one is, I think a really easy one, which is, can we find some micro ways to do youth mental health care in these spaces? It doesn't have to be a major thing. Is it a healing practice that we do before we start the after school program that teaches coping mechanisms to young people? Is it when we recruit mentors for a mentoring program, finding people who are actively attentive to their own mental health, who have found solutions and who can teach that to young people and embody a way of living that is about thriving? Is it equipping parents or caregivers to have meaningful conversations when they're with their children, whatever time of day that is, to invite depth and substance and healing? Those are just a few like micro ways that I think we can introduce the work in non-clinical settings. Second thing I would say is get trained if you can. I think especially for people who have the capacity to and who work in settings where they're working with youth frequently. As a person who, in my role leading the spiritual community, was in a non-clinical setting, but did a lot of youth mental health work, I relied a ton on pastoral care classes. One of my favorite professors in graduate school, Dr. Shaniqua Walker-Barnes, is a psychotherapist who also has her Master of Divinity and is an ordained pastor. And her classes were just amazing in preparing me. And then also continuing education and youth mental health first aid is a great program that people do, and other suicide prevention classes that I did. And so there's sort of practical tools that just help you have more capacity to be able to help navigate. And then a couple last things. One would be to know the limits of your own abilities and capacity. There are professionals in this field for a reason. And so knowing the difference between slight worry and nervousness versus clinical anxiety and what the signs are there are really important. And we want to be able to refer people to professionals when that is needed and not try to sort of like overplay our hand because we're not all equipped to help youth navigate particularly more clinical problems that they need help navigating. And then the last thing I'd say is take care of yourself. Salome, I know people know who are watching this that youth mental health care and mental health care in general can be really emotionally draining and take a lot of emotional labor. And so get a therapist yourself. Know whenever you need your own break, design your own spiritual practices that lead to healing and create boundaries that help you stay in the work. Those are a few things I would name that I think allow us to be people who can offer care in ways that meet youth where they are.
Thanks, Rich. These are really excellent concepts and ones that and I think a lot of people could take to heart. I know I definitely need to subtract more than add in my own life, but I really hope that our audience can pay attention to these tips and ideas. A lot of them are very simple and easy, but have huge impacts in the lives of young people. And so many youth need help right now. I think it's just really important that if listeners could just even do one of those steps that Rich mentioned could make a huge difference. You heard today that Rich even pursued a career in this space because of the adults that were supportive in there. And I could say the same for myself. So you never know the impact of the work that you could do. And it might be as simple as just supporting a youth with being a welcome ear to talk, getting that mental health first aid training. So really grateful that you would share all of those. And as much as I would love to ask you so many more questions, somehow we're out of time. So if I could just ask you, where can folks learn more about the fund and Decolonizing Wealth Project?
Yeah, so go onto our website, decolonizingwealth.com, and there you will find information about our $1 trillion moonshot. You will find information about our narrative work, about sector transformation, and about our reparative giving, our grant making, which includes several different funds. And you can also click on the tab for Contact Us, and that will direct you to sign up for our newsletter. And so that's where you can get information regularly about us and about upcoming open proposals for funds and other resources. And then also follow us on social media. You will find links to all of our accounts on our website. And we're very active on social media and would love to see you there too.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Rich. So appreciate that you would take the time to be with us and share more about this exciting opportunity. So everyone sign up and learn more.
Yeah, this has been great. Thank you again for the invitation. It's so lovely to be with you. Again, I'm a little starstruck, but it's been a great time.
Goodness, the feeling is mutual. Thanks for tuning in to Expanding Access. We hope you're feeling inspired by today's discussion. If you've enjoyed the episode, subscribe and share it with your network. For more content and opportunities to get involved in transforming care, visit behavioralhealthtech.com. Until next time, let's keep pushing boundaries and expanding access together.